Hello and welcome to Chapter 19, Speaking for Social Justice. Let me get you going on sharing this screen, and away we go. It's taking a good minute, but we're getting there. There we go. Who do you think are some of the most influential speakers of the 21st century? We've had some pretty dynamic ones within the 21st century, so a lot can be said. And can you identify their important speeches in history? Even including in the last few years, you can basically identify some of the most influential speakers of the 21st century. One that comes to mind is Always I Have a Dream by MLK. So that's something to always think about when it comes to social justice. MLK Jr., Martin Luther King Jr., talks about dreams and jobs and about racial equality. And especially within this decade, we have already seen a lot going on when it comes to racial equality. Although there are no scholarly consensus about how to define a social movement, what you can think about is many communication scholars characterize a social movement as a group or a collective group of like minded individuals who promote a particular cause, who promote a particular politic, and even an ideology. Social movements are often characterized as outside of the mainstream or uninstitutionalized. And finally, a social movement is characterized by the promotion of social and political change over a long period of time, meaning that the speeches given as part of the social movement are not necessarily localized to one person, but often to many speakers. And so we typically see these in rallies as well as marches. Characteristics of a social movement are in your ebook, and if I'm not mistaken, page 375. It's a group or collective that are driven and are community oriented, something that you have to remember. Promote a non mainstream cause, politics, or ideology. They're not necessarily institutionalized, they consist of many activists, speakers, and leaders, and they push for social or political change. Those are what movements are considered. New media and the publicness of social movements. The one reason to study social protests and political advocacy as the last form of public speaking is that it doesn't necessarily have to be public, nor is the advocacy limited to just speeches. We've seen a lot when you think about it when it comes to a lot of social movements via social media, via social platforms. So now it's not necessarily about a march, it's not necessarily about a rally, but it can also, you can take your social movement onto a much bigger platform and not just, communicate with a few hundred people, but a few million for that matter. So let's go back. Social movement now consists of new media and social media, as said. Arab Spring happened several years ago, about time, about, of course, to a decade ago. Collectively composed of a series of demonstrations, protests, riots, wars, and the Arab Spring resulted in the ousting of a number of political leaders in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, among other things. And again, this was just less than a decade ago. This was back in 2013. So using your cell phones and social media such as Twitter to get the word out and generate a social change. And that's exactly what the Arab Spring was going about. Similar to Occupy Wall Street, a Tea Party movement, but much bigger when it comes to a social movement. What I'm not talking about at the moment is what we have collectively seen in the past couple of weeks when it came to a general election. And again, this is being taped obviously January of 2021. So if you see this at a later date, it's going to be necessarily dated, but nonetheless, it is prevalent. What we have seen in just the year of 2020, when it came to social movements and some sort of political change, has been absolutely outstanding when it comes to our social climate in the United States. And so those are also social movements that have taken place. BLM, what has come about when it comes to protest, to change the political sphere. Those are all social movements that you have to take into consideration and have become actually bigger than a lot of other nations in the past. Civic engagement can be both law abiding and law challenging, and even law breaking, as we have now seen in this past year. Civic engagement is often thought about in terms of voting, participating in a political process. Another part concerns of social agitation, which is basically a deliberate violation of the sanctioned norms of social or political culture. And we've also seen social agitation as well. Civility refers to a speech or behavior that's seen as actually polite. It's not necessarily being agitated, they're being courteous, appropriate given the social media or the public situation. We've even seen that with a lot of rallies that came to Black Lives Matter, where there were speeches, although there was emotion involved, they were still polite and they tried to be as courteous as possible. There were other ones that were socially agitated, so that's also something to keep in mind. This is something that the USA has prided itself on, at least in years past, but during these tumultuous times, it is falling short. So that is something to take into consideration. Let's take a look at this particular speech that I've taken. Now, again, this was actually a few years ago, so it's not within the last year. It's not within the decade of 2020. This is prior to 2020.
As you saw at the top of the show, Sarah Sanders called for civility from the White House.
That's good. You know, that's good because Mike Barnicle, just a couple hours later, the president was going to be giving a speech. So I'm calling for civility. Well, my guy.
Well, didn't he continue the strain of
I'm sure he did. Yeah. I was watching World Cup highlights, so I didn't actually see the speech, but I'm confident that as I point to the screen, we're going to see him talking about lollipops and cuddly bears.
And calling the press,
meadows filled with
the free press, enemies of the people. So,
so we heard that. So but let's hear some of his greatest hits.
If you see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously. Okay? Just knock the hell. I promise you, I will pay for the legal fees, I promise. The guards are very gentle with him. He's walking out like big high fives, smiling, laughing. Like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you. Yeah, get him out. Try not to hurt him. If you do, I'll defend you in court. Don't worry about it. Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, and if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know.
Yeah, so Donald Trump's Second Amendment solution to a President Hillary Clinton. And John Meacham, yesterday we saw some members of the White House and others, supporters of Donald Trump, melt like precious snowflakes in the Arizona sun. It's terrible. Because Maxine Waters said some things that I thought were very regrettable, and she shouldn't have said, but you can look at that, and of course you can say, well, wait, is she really inciting violence? Because that's what a lot of people on Twitter were saying she was doing. You can look at those words and try to figure out if she was. Of course, the president's response, be careful what you ask for, actually was an incitement of violence. But I do wonder how relatives of mine and friends of mine will melt like the biggest, most precious snowflake in the desert sun.
All right, I'm leaving it there because he's just going to continue to go on and on. And so there are two sides to this coin. And that is that the commentary that we saw at a rally from former President Trump was that the rhetoric, the wordings, the words that he used were what can be considered as inciting violence, but more or less, let's take that context away and remember that those types of words, that type of rhetoric is considered social agitation. So let's think of it that way. Not necessarily the best words, because what's going to happen is it's going to um, it may incite a little bit more than just, oh, I think I want to change a movement, I want to change something in terms of politics. I may end up wanting to go further. So let's continue to look at other areas when it comes to social justice and what can be done. You'll begin to identify what you are watching and analyzing as something that pertains to civility or civil disobedience for that matter, via a rally or a protest. And we can go on and look at various types of rallies and protests and basically decipher what's civil disobedience versus what is civil agitation. Either way, you're speaking for social change. And that's exactly what you're trying to identify and what is good and what is bad for the people that are in your crowd. Whether a rally or a protest or even both, there are two basic goals. You're either going to publicize your cause by gathering and a message, or two, you're going to motivate and find a common cause among the like-minded and like feeling. Here's another type of video that I want you to take a look at, and I hope that I can actually pick it up. This chapter, if I can like look at it really quickly, has something to do with watch for when analyzing material from a bank. Let's do this. It's on YouTube. Oh, look, it's going to take me even further. This is fantastic. Give it a minute, and I apologize for the spinning. Sign in to confirm. Shucks darn. Let's see what I can do. Sign in. Let's go further, shall we? Let's go further. Gotta love technology. Gotta love technology. Should have had this popped up prior to, but that's okay. Now you understand. Maybe inappropriate for some users. I highly doubt it. I understand, and I want to proceed. Got it.
Known for his nonviolent campaigns of civil disobedience, Mahatma Gandhi became an international symbol of peace and human rights.
Gandhi has been able to inspire people throughout history.
Born on October 2nd, 1869, in Porbandar, India, Mohandas Gandhi began work in 1893 as a lawyer in South Africa, where he suffered a pivotal encounter of racial injustice.
He trained as an attorney in England, and his first legal job was in South Africa. When he was on a train to Pietermaritzburg, he was thrown off that train because even though he had a first-class train ticket, Indians weren't able to ride in a first-class train. This was a time of racial segregation, and that was a seminal moment in his life, which really turned his career towards civil rights and social justice.
While in South Africa, Gandhi organized the Indian community to oppose prejudice and racial discrimination through nonviolent resistance. During his more than 20 years in the country, Gandhi was arrested 6 times for his acts against the South African government.
What Gandhi means by nonviolence is to not respond to your oppressor or your attacker with equal violence. But he used his body, he used his words, and he used the community. Because when you get enough people rising together to stand in protest, there's a power there.
When Gandhi returned to India in 1915, he became well known as a humanitarian and rising political figure. Gandhi worked for Indian independence over British rule and later was given the name Mahatma, meaning great soul.
His image was iconic of himself in a simple dhoti, in a simple robe, walking quickly with his walking stick and leading masses of people, and this really electrified the imagination of the world, as well as made him very, very well known all throughout India.
After a peaceful protest turned violent in 1922, Gandhi was imprisoned for conspiracy for 2 years. In 1930, Gandhi organized a revolutionary 23-day, 241-mile salt march to the sea. And that same year, he was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year.
The Salt March was probably the most symbolic act of Gandhi's life. It was a protest against British tax law, which taxed salt that all Indians had to buy. And so as Indians are going to the Indian Ocean to get Indian salt, they're being arrested by the thousands. And that one symbol, that one image, really highlighted how unjust British rule was.
Through his peaceful acts of resistance, which included boycotts, protests, and fasting, Gandhi helped India gain independence on August 15, 1947. But 6 months later, on January 30th, 1948, Gandhi was killed when an assassin fired 3 bullets into his chest at point-blank range.
Gandhi brought about nonviolent change, and this inspired the civil rights movement in the United States of America. It inspired Nelson Mandela's leadership for the dismantlement of apartheid in South Africa. Gandhi was a true visionary, and the world has never been the same since.
Okay, I'm going to do what I can. Cancel. I'm going to go back to this and then move forward. And also expand. How am I going to expand this sucker? Maybe I'm not going to. I'll just continue. So although there is valid sense in which we can speak of violence metaphorically through speech and again through rhetoric, for example, a verbal argument can be violent because it dismantles an opposing viewpoint. The craft of public speaking, it has been practiced and taught for centuries, and it has been promoted as a substitute for violence. And that is something to truly think about when it comes to social change. What you want to do, especially when you start to analyze speeches and rallies and protests, is that you want to look for the nonviolence, and that where you can find that and where that change is kicking in. A sense of care or caring is connected or connotated, by the term of craft. So you have to always think about language in terms of rhetoric and words and audience analysis and who are you catering to. And again, it bears repeating that the study of oratory and public speaking has flourished out of democracy. If only because those who would celebrate, inform, and persuade others are simply not allowed to do so. It really is our First Amendment right to have freedom of speech, and we have the right to peacefully protest, and we have the right to discuss our words. But speech changes, remember that, the hearts and the minds, and thus, as the ancient Greeks have observed, it can be perceived as a powerful threat to those in power. So that is the end of chapter 19 regarding social change. And again, what you want to do is take a look at speeches, take a look at your ebook and see exactly the differences, excuse me while I'm trying to shift this around, what the differences are when it comes to inciting violence versus civil disobedience, and see how a change goes about when it comes, social change, if you will. Whether it's trying to, whether it's trying to make a social change for the better within your community, within your state, or within the country. And especially with the variances and the varieties that the United States has experienced just within the last 18 months, there's a lot that can be said about social change and what has actually worked versus what actually hasn't, and then just go from there. I hope you have learned a great deal with chapter 19 when it comes to social change. If there are any questions, easily go back to the book and get some more answers that you feel that you need answered. Thank you.